Hey guys, Mr. Wadsworth here to teach you guys a little bit about our vocab review for section 4. This is the second part of it, so it's the rest of the vocab words we need to know for this section. So let's go ahead and get started on this, make sure we're all keen on these new words. A lot of this stuff you might have already kind of covered in class, so let's get right into it. First thing we have is demand shocks and supply shocks. Remember, demand shocks are when aggregate demand shifts. It can either be a positive demand shock, an increase to the right, or a negative demand shock, and decrease to the left. Remember, a demand shock by itself or a negative demand shock should always make a recessionary gap, and a positive demand shock will make an inflationary gap. If you're wondering, you should definitely know, so I strongly recommend you guys go to page maybe 176, and 176 gives you a listing of all the things that will make a demand shock. For example, fiscal and monetary policy, future expectations, changes in wealth, and existing stocks and future fiscal capital. All those will be demand shifters. As far as supply shocks, those are things that will shift the short-run aggregate supply. So not the long run, but the short-run aggregate supply. A shock is kind of a quick thing you don't expect and then get fixed. So as we cover supply shocks, do know that they're going to act in kind of an odd way opposed to demand shocks. Demand shocks are kind of the bread and butter of our shocks, if you will, but a supply shock or a negative supply shock, like this one right here, let's call it a second one, means that short-run average supply decreased. If you go to page 184, again, strongly recommend it, it'll give you a listing of the 4 things that will create a supply shock. So I do recommend you know what will shift it, or PAIR, it's got a little acronym to help you out. So once you do that, you realize we're gonna have a few different things. The new price level will have increased, but the output will have decreased. When that happens, you have high inflation and a stagnant or recessionary economy. This is called stagflation. Stagflation in economics is something we also call cost push inflation. Essentially, it's a kind of odd way to have a recession, but also have inflation. A major cause of these are when you have a very important input to the economy. For example, energy prices or oil prices. Since oil is in almost anything we buy, and energy is needed for anything we produce, an increase in those prices would make it more expensive to produce anything, thus increasing the actual amount it costs to make stuff, decreasing supply. Therefore, we have more expensive goods and less of them. So, cost push inflation, stagflation, kind of the same thing, economic term versus your history book term that we had in the 70s. The other thing to note with this is a recessionary gap. Remember, a recessionary gap is always when output decreases. So you have unemployment above the natural rate, below full employment, and below potential output. Inflationary gaps are when we have output over here to the right of potential output, or long run aggregate supply. That means we'll have an unemployment rate below the natural rate of unemployment, creating inflationary pressures, and we'll be producing above potential output. So those are your 2 gaps. If you want to see something very useful, is how we get to the self-correcting part. And by the way, recessionary and inflationary gaps are also called output gaps. With these output gaps, we end up with a level of production which is not going to be sustainable. The sustainable amount of production, if we go ahead and look at this and take away our negative supply shock, is this. This right here is our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. It's where short-run average supply and aggregate demand intersect at the long-run aggregate supply. This is sustainable production. We can keep producing at this price level, we can keep producing at this output level, and that's where we want to be. Anything outside of it will create inflationary or deflationary pressures to go ahead and get us back to here, which is why it's self-correcting. So again, I do recommend you guys go to page 197, 198. It covers that whole process. I think we've already covered it. That shows us exactly how we can go from a inflationary gap and how the market will self-correct back to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Other things Also, if we're calculating output gaps, so let's put this kind of away for later. What we can do to calculate output gaps is use this formula the book gives us. Essentially, to calculate an output gap, you have the actual aggregate output. So essentially, where short run average supply and aggregate demand intersect. That output level, subtract it from potential output. What that'll give you is a positive or negative number, divide it by potential output, and multiply it by 100, and that'll give you essentially the percent off we are from potential output. So, easy way to kind of think of it is, let's say we have an inflationary gap. So, aggregate output is 110, potential output is 100. So when we subtract, we'll end up with positive 10. Remember, if it's a recessionary gap, that would be 90, and we'd have negative 10. You divide that by potential output, which is 100. 100 goes into 10.1. Well, 0.1 times 100 is going to give us 10, essentially 10%. And that would be our output gap. So real simple math for us to kind of use and calculate these formulas. Very, very simple stuff. Okay, if we keep going, we can go ahead to stabilization policy. All right, stabilization policy essentially deals with us having a inflationary or recessionary gap and wanting to fix it and not let it self-correct. Essentially, we don't want to wait for that long run. We want to fix the problem faster. So this is something governments do. Even governments who say, no, we're not Keynesian, we don't want to fix it, the market's great. When a recession hits, people do expect the government to take action. And if they do, or if they don't, people get quite upset. So stabilization policies are ways of using monetary and fiscal policy to either reduce recession severity or fix a recession or inflationary gap quickly. So ways they can do that, one is a social insurance. Social insurance, we'll get to how those can be used later, but those are your kind of general welfare policies, the way of when the economy's bad, instead of letting people suffer very badly to no fault of their own, you can have the government try to kind of help them out. These are our Social Security, these are our food stamps, our unemployment insurances. All right. Other things we have for this type of stabilization policies are expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. So, covering what those are, if we end up with let's say an inflationary gap, something we can do is use these tools to bring it back. So if we have an inflationary gap, how do we get to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? We need to go ahead and move aggregate demand back this way. So we would use government purchases of goods and services. Government purchases of goods and services, it's G. We reduce it, then use the multiplier, and we can reduce aggregate demand. We could also change taxes. So to fix an inflationary gap, we could raise taxes, and that would move aggregate demand back. Or don't forget, the kind of lesser used known one is a change in government transfer. So we could increase government transfer payments, and that would go ahead and move aggregate demand back. One key thing to remember, government transfers uses the tax multiplier, not the spending multiplier. Spending multiplier only works for government purchases of goods and services, because with a government transfer, when I give you money, nothing's being produced. Okay, if we have contractionary fiscal policy, the opposite would be true. If we want to bring the economy back, shift aggregate demand to the left, what we would go ahead and do then, that would be contractionary fiscal policy, would get rid of an inflationary gap. If we have a recessionary gap, to fix a recessionary gap, we need to bring aggregate demand to the right and increase it. So we could increase government purchases of goods and services, decrease taxes, or increase government transfers. Again, government transfers use the tax multiplier. All right, moving on to lump sum taxes. Lump sum tax is an easy concept. We've covered already. It's a single tax that everyone pays the same amount on, and once you pay it, that's it. So it's not a percent base, it's just an amount. So we could have a tax on everyone of $1,500. Everyone needs to pay it. They're unpopular because rich people barely notice it, poor people notice it a lot, and it tends to not be that popular. But just do remember, lump sum taxes, that's a sunk cost. Once you pay it, it doesn't change your behavior. All right, Other things to know is when we're doing expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, and I know you guys can't see it quite at the bottom, but we'll have discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is essentially what we're covering here, but it's the government's discretion. What they can do is go ahead and say, we're going to make some big spending projects, build roads, bridges, hospitals, whatever, to increase spending in the economy on goods and services, including military equipment. Also, they could change discretionary taxes, raising taxes, lowering taxes to fit the economic needs at the time, or changes in government transfers. We're going to make a big stimulus payment or cut payments to certain goods and services, or certain services, which are government transfers, like welfare type payments. So, but the other thing governments use is automatic stabilizers. What automatic stabilizers are is, well, I listed them here for you guys. Is there ways that the government can make laws, typically types of social insurances usually, that when the economy's bad or good, they automatically kick in without the government having to act. The problem with discretionary measures is first you have to figure out, you have a bunch of lag, and there'll be types of lags you need to know. One type of lag is, we don't know when a recession begins. So the recession might have started months later before Congress goes, yeah, there is a problem. Once they do that, they have to go, all right, how are we going to fix it, and come up with a plan. Then they have to deliberate on it in Congress, and months and months and months and months are passing. Then there's implementation lag of, okay, we passed it, good, let's pat ourselves on the back, we fixed the economy. But it could take months or years for that money to actually get spent. So if years have gone by, then, well, the recession's over. The automatic correctors or self-correcting has already taken place. And now this big boost comes to the economy trying to fix a problem that ended, creating more problems. So there are a lot of automatic stabilizers to kind of keep us more centered, closer to the long run, and make recessions less bad or booms less kind of inflationary and problematic. And there would be things like this. In red, I have the kind of spending options. So unemployment, Medicare, WIC, if you don't know what WIC is, it's essentially food stamps. Those are automatic. So before anyone knows there's a recession, people are going to be unemployed. They're going to be worse off. They're going to be poor, which means they'll demand more unemployment, Medicare, and food stamps. So these things kick in before anyone has to act, increasing spending the economy. More unemployed people means the government automatically has more unemployment payments. Also, if there's a recession, people will be getting poorer. And as their incomes decrease, there'll be a change in tax revenue. If everyone's poor, they'll pay less dollars in taxes, and therefore, it's like there was a tax cut. On the other hand, if the economy is doing really well and we have an inflationary gap, automatic stabilizers will automatically kick in. If unemployment's low and people are richer, they won't need unemployment or as much Medicare or as much food stamps because people can get good jobs and make good money. So government spending decreases, there'll be contractionary, get us away from the inflationary gap, and as people get richer and their incomes rise, they'll pay a higher amount of tax dollars because taxes are percentage based. So if you're richer, you pay more dollars in taxes. And that would go ahead and keep the economy stable. It won't stop recessions or inflationary gaps, but it'll keep them kind of closer to center. So those are our terms for this week. Good luck studying, guys, and good luck on your quiz on Monday.